Jon Snow stood atop a ridge of ice-crusted stone overlooking the ragged wilderness beyond the wall. He felt the wind whisper through the fur lining of his cloak, sending a chill deeper than the frost could reach. Ghost was by his side, the great white direwolf who had been his steadfast companion through every tumultuous trial. Snow fell in flurries around them, dancing in the last glow of dusk. Night was close, and with it came the dreaded promise that the Night King and his army would stir. The wall's shadows stretched long, and the torches far below cast flickering orbs of light on the ancient ice, a meager defense against the looming darkness. Yet Jon did not descend back into the safety of Castle Black. His eyes swept over a wide valley blanketed by swirling snowdrifts. He was waiting. Beneath the hush of wind, he heard the steady padding of paws. Ghost's ears twitched, and the dire wolf lifted his head, nose quivering. Jon knew what the wolf sensed, the approach of another presence, something huge, something primal. Jon's breath plumed in the air as he exhaled slowly. Moments later, a pair of luminous eyes emerged from the gloom. Another dire wolf, as dark as midnight, loped cautiously toward them. The creature moved with silent grace, weaving between frosted rocks and the stunted remains of winter-hardened shrubs. Its fur shimmered under the faint moonlight that began to break through the thickening clouds. The dark direwolf paused a dozen paces from Jon, staring him down with an intelligence that bordered on human. For a moment, Jon feared it was Nymeria, Arya's lost companion. But the wolf was larger even than Ghost, older, wilder. This new direwolf let out a low rumble, neither a growl nor a purr, but some sound caught between warning and curiosity. Ghost sniffed the air and answered with a soft sound of his own. The two massive wolves stared each other down, glowing eyes reflecting the gloom. Jon knew that direwolves were rare, so much so that he had only heard rumors of a few surviving north of the wall. Ghost was an albino, distinct as a single beacon in the darkest night. Yet here stood another direwolf the size of a small horse, scars crisscrossing its muzzle. It looked at Jon not with hostility, but with a kind of grim purpose. Jon could almost sense an unspoken question in that stare. He had come north of the wall to gather anything, any ally, any resource, that might stand against the Night King's rising threat. The armies of men were fractious, uncertain. The realm was battered by politics and betrayals, kneeling leaders who could not see past their own lands. Jon had to be sure there was another way. Too many had died, and too many more would follow if the living did not find something new to turn the tide. The dark direwolf snapped its head to the side, as though beckoning them to follow. Ghost looked at Jon, his bright red eyes reflecting moonlight, as though urging him to heed the call. Jon gave a nod and placed his hand gently on Ghost's flank, a gesture that said they would go together. He set off after the mysterious wolf, heart pounding beneath the layers of fur and leather. The trio wound their way through jagged paths, the wind growing fiercer with each step. Jon tried to keep his eyes on the wolf's outline. Once or twice he nearly lost it in the swirling snow. But the beast moved with uncanny confidence, never hesitating. Jon followed for what felt like hours until the moon was high and the clouds parted, revealing a sky full of distant stars. They reached a wide clearing deep in a lonely stretch of the haunted forest. Stark trees, long stripped of leaves by the everlasting cold, loomed all around. At first, Jon saw nothing extraordinary, just a ring of trees and a floor of packed snow. Then he heard it, the murmuring growls, the shifting of many bodies. Out from the shadows stepped a dozen direwolves, then 24, and soon he could discern more hidden in the gloom. All eyes were upon him. He felt their combined presence like a physical weight. Ghost's ears flattened, but he did not cower. The white wolf walked a step ahead of Jon, a sentinel, prepared to defend his companion if necessary. Among these silent watchers, Jon saw every color of fur: gray, black, silver, even a reddish-brown. Some were as large as the scarred wolf who had led them here. Others seemed younger, more wiry in build. But they were all enormous, far larger than any common wolf south of the wall. The air crackled with tension and old magic. Jon could almost feel the ancient power of the direwolves, a link that spanned ages older than men's kingdoms. He remembered old Nan's tales, how the first men had fought alongside direwolves in ages past, forging bonds through blood and night. He remembered the sigil of House Stark, the direwolf's head, representing more than just a family crest. It represented the North, the harshness and the unbreakable spirit that let them endure all hardships. Jon inhaled slowly, his breath forming a thin cloud of vapor. He had no illusions that these beasts were tame or that they could ever be truly domesticated. But they had gathered here for a reason. The lead wolf, the massive dark-furred alpha, approached Ghost. The two circled one another carefully, sniffing, gauging. Then they touched noses, and Jon saw the tension in Ghost's posture melt ever so slightly. The alpha turned to Jon, stepping closer until Jon could see the silver hairs around its muzzle and the reflection of the moon in its glowing yellow eyes. Jon willed himself to remain still. He offered a gloved hand, palm outward. The wolf sniffed, then let out a breath that almost felt like a sigh. An indescribable moment passed between them, a silent understanding. The alpha let out a short, clipped howl. At once, the circle of direwolves joined in, their voices echoing through the dark forest. The sound reverberated off the ancient trunks, rising into the star-laced heavens. For a heartbeat, Jon felt as though he stood at the epicenter of the world's oldest choir, a raw, primeval melody that sang of ice, wind, and the unyielding spirit of the North. When the howl ceased, the wolves watched Jon with an alert stillness. He felt as if they waited for him to lead, and in that very moment, he understood that this was what he had hoped for, an alliance with the wildest, oldest guardians of the North. Whatever the Night King planned, it would not only be men in opposition. Jon had dreamed of forging a link with these mysterious denizens. That dream was becoming reality. He knelt in the snow, the icy crystals crunching beneath his weight. He looked each wolf in the eye, letting them see his sincerity. He remembered all he had lost and all he still stood to lose. He thought of Samwell Tarly's unwavering friendship, of Tormund Giantsbane's boisterous loyalty, of Sansa's steadfast spirit in Winterfell, and of Arya, out there somewhere in the world, fiercely independent as ever. He thought of Daenerys Targaryen, her dragons, her unwavering intent to break the wheel of tyranny, and how she, too, had an army of creatures not quite of this world. Jon realized he stood at a threshold of possibility. Men, dragons, and direwolves uniting to face a threat beyond comprehension. The Night King's legions of undead would shudder the hearts of lesser men. But if Jon could bring the direwolves to war, he might stand a chance. For a moment, he closed his eyes and thought of the wordless vow he had made when he chose to come north. He would do whatever it took to save the living from the endless night. The alpha dipped its head, and Jon did the same. Ghost silently moved to stand at Jon's side, as though sealing the oath. High above, the moon's glow intensified, silhouetting the host of direwolves in a halo of pale light. There, in that hidden clearing under the endless winter sky, a bond was forged. A man of the Night's Watch, reborn as king in the north, forging alliance with an ancient pack that had roamed these lands since time immemorial. Days passed in frigid solitude as Jon traveled among the direwolves, learning their patterns, their unity, their silent communication. Ghost had always been different from ordinary wolves, far more intelligent, empathic, sharing some bond with Jon that defied easy explanation. Now Jon realized that the entire species possessed a vestige of that same bond. The direwolves recognized him as kin, likely because he bore the blood of the first men through the Starks. Perhaps there was also a deeper magic at play, but Jon did not care to question it too deeply. All that mattered was that they recognized him as a leader, or at least as a friend. He found that he could move among them without fear, though he was always alert, always respectful. The Alpha, whom Jon began to call Duskfang, a name that arose from the wolf's near-black fur and the faint silver markings around its face, tolerated Jon's closeness as no other human had likely been tolerated in centuries. Duskfang and Ghost would wander the clearing, sometimes vanishing into the deeper forest with the rest of the pack. They returned by sunrise or moonrise, depending on their hunt. In the nights, by a meager fire, Jon reflected on the war to come. His mind often wandered to Daenerys, forging alliances in the south, rallying the lords and ladies who would heed her call. He thought of Tyrion Lannister's sharp wit, of how quickly the imp understood the stakes. Would they believe him when he returned with an entire host of direwolves at his back? Would they welcome such fearsome beasts as allies? Or would it only sow further terror among those who still clung to old suspicions? Jon resolved that it mattered little. The living would have to set aside their fears or face extinction. One frigid morning, Jon woke to find the entire pack restless. A faint keening sound drifted through the forest, unlike anything he had heard before. Even the wind seemed stilled, as if holding its breath. Ghost and Duskfang exchanged urgent glances. Jon stood, pulling his cloak tight, and surveyed the ring of direwolves. Their hackles rose, and a low rumble of concern spread from beast to beast. Something was wrong. Jon followed the direction of their gazes, peering through the gray light of dawn. The horizon was still a haze of snow, but he sensed the unnatural presence. The air grew colder, if that were possible, and a tingle of dread ran along Jon's spine. He had felt this chill before, on the other side of Hardhome, when the Night King's shade had loomed high over a doomed shore. It was the chill of death incarnate. He moved swiftly, hoping to find higher ground. The direwolves, as one, paced behind him, ears pricked. They knew an enemy was near. Soon, in a clearing only half a mile away, Jon saw them, whites, perhaps 24, shambling through the snow, their dead eyes rolling in their frozen sockets. From behind the whites strode for White Walkers, tall and ghastly, their armor glowing with an otherworldly sheen. Their blades, forged from ice, caught the weak dawn light and refracted it into shards of terror. Jon pressed himself against the trunk of a massive tree, heart hammering. The direwolves fanned out around him in an almost perfect semicircle. Normally, Jon would want to flee or find more soldiers, but there was no time for that, and the direwolves seemed disinclined to retreat. A savage growl emanated from Duskfang's throat, and the other direwolves mirrored it. Ghost lowered his head, baring fangs. The White Walkers spotted them. One raised a clawed hand in a silent command. The whites hissed and began trudging forward, arms outstretched, bones creaking. Jon glimpsed the milky eyes of what had once been a wildling, the torn skin of what had once been a ranger of the Watch. He drew Longclaw, the Valyrian steel blade that had served him so faithfully. No matter how many times he faced the undead, his courage was always tested anew by their relentless horror. The whites advanced. The direwolves waited, their shoulders tense, awaiting a signal from their alpha. Duskfang stood firm at the center, tail swishing through the snow. Jon braced himself. The first wave of whites came within striking distance, and that was when Duskfang let out a thunderous roar, part howl and part battle cry. As one, the pack lunged. Jon had never witnessed such ferocity. The direwolves hurled themselves at the undead, smashing into their ranks with unstoppable momentum. Jaws closed on rotting limbs, snapping bones and severing tendons in an instant. Claws raked across the torsos of whites, sending them sprawling to the ground, limbs jerking grotesquely. Ghost darted in and out, swift and lethal, tearing through foes with savage grace. Jon moved among them, swinging Longclaw, the Valyrian steel cleaving through brittle flesh and bone. An arm fell away from a white's shoulder, but still it scrabbled forward until Jon crushed its skull underfoot. Another white lunged at him, clacking its jaws. Jon slashed downward, separating its head from its body. Rancid black fluid spattered across the snow. Overhead, the White Walkers watched impassively, though one strode forward with a blade of ice glinting in its grip. Jon faced it, heart pounding, recalling that only Valyrian steel or dragonglass could destroy a White Walker. They locked gazes for a moment, the creature's frozen blue eyes meeting Jon's resolute brown. The White Walker struck first, a slash so quick that Jon barely had time to react. He parried with Longclaw, steel ringing against ice. A shock of cold rippled up Jon's arm, numbing his fingers. He gritted his teeth and pushed back. The direwolves continued to decimate the lesser whites, tearing them apart in a flurry of snarls and blood-chilling yowls. But the White Walkers were not so easily undone. Another one advanced on the flank, brandishing its dreadful weapon. Duskfang bounded toward it, teeth snapping. The White Walker swung its blade in a downward arc. Direwolf and Walker met in a flash of frost and fang. For a horrifying moment, Jon thought Duskfang might be cut down. But the wolf twisted at the last instant, evading the ice blade by a hair's breadth. Duskfang's jaws clamped down on the walker's arm, the beast's immense weight driving the creature to the ground. A terrible sound followed as the ice blade shattered on the ground. The White Walker wailed, an unholy noise that rattled Jon's teeth. Duskfang's muzzle flared with raw power as the alpha bit down with crushing force. The walker's form cracked, as if made of glass, and then it exploded in a misty swirl of frost. Splintered remnants of its armor scattered, and the wolf recoiled with a yelp, shaken but unhurt. Jon refocused on his own foe. The White Walker lunged again, its strikes an elegant dance of death. Twice Jon barely parried in time. The cold emanating from the blade sapped his strength, making his muscles feel leaden. Still, he summoned every ounce of will he possessed. He thought of all the people who depended on him. In one swift counter, he brought Longclaw slicing upward. The blade found the walker's midsection, biting through armor of ice. A keening shriek ripped through the air as the walker disintegrated into a swirl of snowflakes, lost to the wind. The remaining two White Walkers, seeing their comrades destroyed, raised their frozen weapons in a silent beckoning, as if summoning unseen forces from the forest. The direwolves circled, howling defiance. Jon stood among them, breath ragged, sword at the ready. Time seemed to slow, the air pregnant with the possibility of more undead. But instead of reinforcements arriving, the White Walkers themselves began to retreat, stepping backward into the swirling snow, disappearing into the gloom. Jon let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Around him, the direwolves tore apart the last of the whites. Severed limbs twitched in the snow before going still. The stench of death and decay hung heavy. Duskfang limped slightly, a minor cut along its flank glistening red against the black fur. Jon sheathed Longclaw and rushed to the alpha's side. The wolf allowed him to inspect the wound, which was shallow but needed tending. He felt a surge of relief. They had emerged victorious, even though the undead had come upon them unexpectedly. But Jon could also sense that this was just a taste of what lay ahead. The Night King would send more, far more, and they would be accompanied by monstrous abominations beyond counting. The time for forging this alliance was short. They had to move before the White Walkers returned in even greater numbers. Jon cared for the wounded direwolves as best he could. He had limited supplies, some meager bandages, a few pouches of herbs. The wolves were remarkably hardy, and within a day, most were back on their feet, prowling through the snow as though the battle had only stirred their vigor. Duskfang bore its fresh scar without complaint, continuing to patrol the perimeter of the clearing with unwavering resolve. Jon knew that if the direwolves were to truly aid him in a larger battle, they had to move south. The living could not afford to wait while the Night King gathered his strength. The question was, how to lead an entire pack, perhaps even multiple packs, across the wall without causing panic or chaos, and more importantly, how to keep them from being seen as threats by the men of the Night's Watch or the lords in the north. Though he had relinquished his position as Lord Commander, many of the brothers at Castle Black still respected Jon Snow's word. But would they accept a legion of direwolves passing through the gates? Would they even believe it if Jon claimed these were allies, not beasts bent on slaughter? Late in the evening, Jon sat by a crackling fire he'd managed to build with the wood of a gnarled pine. Ghost and Duskfang dozed nearby, both exhausted from the day's exertions. The stars glittered overhead. Jon stared into the flames, remembering the words of his father, Eddard Stark, or the man he once believed was his father, and recalling how honor guided every choice. He thought of the vow he had made to defend the realm of men. On the morrow, he decided he would lead the direwolves south. He would not hide them. He would simply do everything in his power to ensure that no blood was spilled. He would speak to his loyal friends in the Watch, to Tormund Giantsbane and the Wildlings, to the Lords of the North if necessary. If they could accept free folk and even a Targaryen queen, perhaps they could accept direwolves. The true enemy was the Night King, and time was too short for petty prejudice. Jon woke at first light. Snow fell in gentle flurries, settling on the forest floor. He gathered his gear, slung his sword belt over his shoulders, and whistled softly for Ghost. One by one, the direwolves assembled, some yawning wide, others shaking their fur free of clinging frost. They moved like a silent tide around Duskfang, who padded to Jon's side and looked up expectantly. Jon nodded, a silent agreement passing between them. They set off for Castle Black. The journey was both eerie and awe-inspiring. The direwolves traveled swiftly, forming small hunting parties to catch prey along the way. Jon marveled at their discipline. Rarely did they squabble among themselves. The older wolves guided the young, teaching them how to stalk snow hares or caribou that roamed the forest. Even Ghost, who had always been a loner among wolves south of the Wall, found a natural place within this new hierarchy. As they neared the edge of the haunted forest, the glow of the Wall began to appear in the distance. A colossal barrier of ice, centuries old, shimmering under the wan daylight. The sight of it filled Jon with conflicting emotions. Once, that wall had represented his duty, his entire life. Now, it felt more like a threshold he had to cross for a higher purpose. By dusk, they emerged onto the open tundra within sight of Castle Black. Torches flickered along the ramparts, and Jon spotted the silhouettes of black-clad men pacing the top. He breathed deeply, trying to calm his racing heart. He had to consider how to approach without triggering a volley of arrows. He signaled the direwolves to stay back while he advanced with Ghost and Duskfang. Men on the wall shouted, and Jon could hear the echo of confusion traveling along the ramparts. He raised his hands, calling out, "I am Jon Snow. Hold your arrows." If any recognized his voice, they made no immediate acknowledgement. But the archers did not loose their shafts. Instead, Jon heard a horn blast, one long note. This was a sign that rangers approached. A figure appeared above the gate, and Jon recognized Dolorous Ed's haggard face. Ed's eyes went wide when he saw the mass of direwolves behind Jon, and Jon could almost imagine the man's typical blend of sarcastic dread swirling through his head. Still, Ed did not shoot. Instead, he gestured for the gate to be opened. Jon walked forward, keeping his pace measured, trusting that the direwolves would stay in place until summoned. At the threshold, he was greeted by a dozen black brothers armed with spears and crossbows. Ed stepped forward, incredulity etched on his features. "Jon, I never thought I'd say this, but you look even more grim than usual. And what in the name of all the gods is that behind you?" Jon glanced over his shoulder. The pack waited silently, eyes glinting in the torchlight. "Dire wolves," he said as calmly as he could. "They're here to fight the Night King." Ed let out a low whistle. "You always did have a knack for bringing home strays. A white direwolf was shocking enough, but now you come with an army of them." He shook his head in disbelief, though a ghost of a smile tugged at his lips. "Well, I suppose we ought to thank you for not letting them storm the gate unannounced." Jon explained as briefly as possible that the direwolves were allies, not beasts to be feared. He spoke of the encounter with the White Walkers in the forest and how the direwolves had fought by his side. He appealed to Ed's sense of duty, reminding him that anything that stood against the dead was a friend. Ed, for all his cynical grumbling, understood the gravity of the threat. He nodded slowly and ordered the men to stand down. Still, there was no simple way to guide such a large pack inside Castle Black's walls without causing chaos. Jon convinced Ed to allow them entry into the courtyard, but only in small groups. The direwolves filtered in, some sniffing the air warily, others baring their teeth at the unfamiliar smell of men and steel. The Black brothers stood at attention, weapons at the ready in case any beast attacked. But no such violence broke out. The pack, while alert, followed Jon's lead. Within an hour, the courtyard was full of the largest wolves any of the Night's Watch had ever seen. Men stared in awe. A hush fell, broken only by the occasional whine or growl. Snow drifted gently from the sky, dusting the wolves' fur. Ghost and Duskfang took positions near Jon, towering over the occasional stray dog that slinked between buildings, tail tucked in abject terror. Jon gathered the senior members of the Watch, men he still trusted despite having given up his command. Ed, along with a few veterans, listened as Jon recounted everything that had happened since his departure. He spoke of forging alliances in the south, of Daenerys Targaryen's dragons, of the quickly escalating threat in the north. He detailed how he had stumbled upon the Direwolves, how they had shown intelligence and a willingness to fight the undead. "So you propose to march them south?" asked Ed, trying to mask his astonishment. Jon nodded. "Yes, the living must unite, men, wolves, dragons. Anything that can stand against the Night King. We cannot do this alone." A veteran ranger rubbed his beard, eyeing the direwolves through a window. "If these beasts can truly be controlled, they'd be a terror on the battlefield. I've seen one direwolf rip apart 5 men. An entire pack would be unstoppable." Jon glanced at his own hands. "They aren't ours to command, not like well-trained hounds. But they understand me. They know who the real enemy is. That might be enough." It studied Jon's face. "All right, I believe you. We'll do our part. Let's just pray the Southern Lords don't lose their wits at the sight of these creatures. You'll have to handle that part on your own." Jon's breath came easier. The first hurdle was crossed, though countless more lay ahead. He had to make haste to Winterfell and beyond, to gather the banners and warn everyone that the Night King's armies were stirring. More skirmishes like the one in the forest would be the least of their worries when the real assault began. That night, Castle Black buzzed with apprehension. The direwolves, uninterested in the cramped quarters of men, bedded down in the courtyard. Ed offered Jon a modest chamber, and Jon tried to sleep, but his mind churned with worry. While he had found powerful allies in the direwolves, he knew that the Night King would not be idle. Perhaps the others already marched for Eastwatch or the Shadow Tower, or perhaps they plotted to breach the wall through foul sorcery. At dawn, Jon rose, determined to move quickly. Ed arranged for the gates to open, and the watchmen parted like a black tide before the mass of wolves. Jon stood at the forefront, a lone figure leading this extraordinary legion. They stepped out onto the wintry plains with heads held high. Ghost and Duskfang walked on either side of Jon, while the others followed in a loose formation, forging their own path through the drifts. The journey to Winterfell was slow. Though direwolves were fleet, they needed time to hunt and rest. Moreover, Jon feared swift travel would alarm every village and holdfast they encountered. He decided to skirt most settlements, traveling through the less populated regions of the north. Occasionally, they happened upon a farm or a small hamlet, and panic would ensue at the sight of so many giant wolves. Jon made efforts to calm the inhabitants, always revealing himself, making sure none of the wolves attacked. More than once, a frightened farmer brandished a pitchfork or a bow. But the direwolves, almost eerily, sensed Jon's tension and held their ground without aggression. As the days turned into weeks, rumors spread ahead of them. Word traveled faster than Jon had anticipated. Whispers of a man in black leading an army of colossal wolves reached Winterfell long before Jon did. Most folks could scarcely believe it. Some said it was a host of demons. Others claimed the old gods had taken physical form to defend the north. By the time Jon at last came within sight of the towering walls of Winterfell, he found the gates shut tight, the battlements lined with wary soldiers. He halted at a respectful distance. Those on the walls clearly recognized him. There was no mistaking Jon Snow nor Ghost. But they also saw the score upon score of direwolves arrayed behind him, and their fear was palpable. Trumpets blared nervously, and Jon imagined the soldiers exchanging troubled glances. He ordered the pack to remain still. Duskfang paced behind him, ears flat, waiting. Finally, the gates creaked open, and a small party emerged. At their head was Sansa Stark, flanked by Brienne of Tarth and several guards. They advanced toward Jon on horseback, though the horses whinnied nervously, sensing the predators. Sansa reined in her mare a few paces from Jon. She was cloaked in thick gray fur, and her red hair spilled over her shoulders like flames. Her blue eyes flicked from Jon to the direwolves and back. "By the gods, Jon," she said, her voice low. "Word reached us, but I hardly believed it. Are you well?" Jon dipped his head. "I am. Sansa, I have dire news. And direwolves." He attempted a small, wry smile. She managed a faint, astonished laugh. Then, more seriously, "We've heard rumors that the Night King moves again, that there were sightings of the dead in the far north. We didn't expect you to return so soon." Jon cut a glance at the massive pack behind him. "I can't say I intended to bring an army of wolves, but the north has its own ways. We've faced the dead together already. They chose to fight by my side." Sansa took a moment, letting her gaze wander across the pack. A few guards held torches even in daylight, as if that tiny light might protect them from the beasts. "They're enormous," she breathed. "But if they will help defend Winterfell, the north, and all the living, then we'll find a way." Brienne, as stoic as ever, studied the wolves with a mixture of awe and caution. "Will they enter the castle?" Jon shook his head. "I think the courtyard and the surrounding lands will suffice for now. They don't like being confined." Sansa nodded. "Very well. We'll open the gates, but we must ensure no one panics." Jon agreed. He turned to Duskfang, murmuring in a steady, calm tone. The alpha wolf's ears twitched. Slowly, the pack began to follow as Jon walked with Sansa toward the open gate. Soldiers clutched their spears and swords, but Jon held up a hand, his bearing confident, and the direwolves padded into Winterfell without so much as a snarl. Within minutes, the courtyard resembled a scene from an ancient legend, scores of wolves prowling among the stone walls, while the people of Winterfell stared in trembling wonder. In the days that followed, Jon worked tirelessly to assure the people that these wolves were not a threat. He posted extra guards on the walls and told them explicitly to lower their weapons unless under direct attack. The direwolves, in turn, seemed to sense they had arrived in some semblance of safety, for they roamed calmly, rarely giving anyone cause for alarm. A few times, a young pup or a bold soldier tried to approach them. The direwolves would simply stare, unblinking, or trot away with silent disdain. Ghost, somewhat accustomed to human company, was the only one who seemed at ease wandering the corridors now and then, trailing after Jon like a ghostly shadow. There was another who was not afraid, Arya Stark. She had returned to Winterfell some time ago, though she flitted in and out like a shadow herself. When she heard of her brother's return, leading a great pack of direwolves, Arya seemed almost giddy with anticipation. She found Jon in the great hall, surrounded by a cluster of northern lords who had come to pay respects and gawk at these new allies. Arya slipped in quietly, her leather boots scarcely making a sound on the stone floor. Jon spotted her, and a wide grin broke across his tired features. He excused himself from the lords, crossing the hall to embrace his sister. "Arya!" She hugged him fiercely, then pulled back, her keen gray eyes flicking past him to the courtyard beyond. "I heard you have wolves, lots of them. Have you seen Nymeria?" Jon hesitated, recalling the black direwolf that had led him to the pack. "There's one that might be her, but she's grown so large, and she has scars on her muzzle. Couldn't be sure, but she's here in the pack." Arya's breath caught in her throat. Without another word, she turned on her heel and dashed outside. Jon followed in her wake, weaving between retinue and servants until they reached the courtyard. The pack was sprawled in various corners, some dozing, others alert. Arya scanned them, stepping carefully between the massive bodies, her heart pounding. She saw Ghost first, nodding to him with a fond smirk. Then she spotted a dark-furred wolf with jagged scars across the muzzle, lying in a corner, half asleep. "Nymeria?" she whispered, voice trembling with a mixture of hope and fear. The wolf's ears perked. Slowly, she lifted her head, golden eyes narrowing. Arya approached, her hands raised, palms out, as if to show she bore no threat. The wolf sniffed the air. Jon could almost feel the tension, as though the entire courtyard held its breath. Finally, the wolf rose to its feet with a fluid grace. It towered over Arya, who was no child anymore, but still the direwolf dwarfed her. A low rumble resonated in its throat, not quite hostile, more uncertain. Arya stopped a pace away, tears brimming in her eyes. "Nymeria, it's me," she breathed. For a moment, Jon feared the wolf would turn away, but then Nymeria, for it truly seemed to be her, pressed her scarred muzzle into Arya's outstretched hands. Arya closed her eyes, tears coursing down her cheeks, and gently stroked the dark fur. The courtyard seemed to sigh in relief, and murmurs of astonishment spread among the onlookers. Jon's throat tightened. He remembered how Arya had set Nymeria free to save her from Cersei's wrath so many years ago. Now, wolf and girl were reunited, though both had changed beyond recognition. It was as though fate had brought them back together for the final battle. With that reunion, the final piece of Jon's plan fell into place. He had the North's acceptance, at least tentatively. He had the loyalty of the direwolves. The only question now was how to unite all this with Daenerys' forces in the south and rally the rest of Westeros. Winterfell had become the fulcrum of the living's hope, and time ticked away with each passing night. As the northern lords gathered in council, Jon addressed them in the Great Hall. The direwolves remained outside, though Ghost and Nymeria lingered near the door, as if standing guard. Lords and ladies were varied expressions. Some were intrigued, others frightened. Sansa and Arya sat at the head table, along with Bran Stark, whose gaze seemed to pierce through mortal concerns. Jon explained that the Night King was real, that the dead were marching. He spoke of the battle he'd fought alongside the direwolves, how even the White Walkers had been driven back. He pleaded for unity, for readiness, for a renewed call to arms. He recounted Daenerys Targaryen's vow to come north. Some lords bristled at the mention of a Targaryen queen, their old loyalties slow to change. But Sansa vouched for the seriousness of the threat, and Bran spoke softly of visions that showed the endless hordes of whites. In the end, most agreed. The memory of the Battle of the Bastards was fresh enough, the taste of war and the knowledge of external threats still raw. And none could deny that direwolves in the courtyard made for a potent symbol. If the old magic of the North was awakening, who were they to stand against it? Preparations began. Ravens were sent to every corner of the North, calling bannermen to rally at Winterfell. A message was sent to Daenerys, wherever her forces were camped, urging haste. The forge fires roared as blacksmiths hammered out weapons and reforged old swords. Stores of grain and salted meat were gathered, though the winter threatened to starve them if the war dragged on too long. All the while, Jon divided his time between the war councils of men and the bond he nurtured with the direwolves. He ensured they were fed, forging hunts in the neighboring forests. He assigned certain wildlings who had once roamed beyond the wall to tend to the wolves' needs, those who understood the wilderness. Tormund Giantsbane arrived soon after, beaming at the sight of such beasts. "A fine army, Crow," he said with a hearty laugh, clapping Jon on the back. "Better than crows, I'd say." Jon spent hours walking the outskirts of Winterfell, the direwolves padding silently at his side. He listened to the wind in the trees and the hushed whispers of his own thoughts. Sometimes, he found himself standing before the old godswood, kneeling beneath the heart tree with its solemn face carved into the bark, red sap tears trickling. He prayed, though not in any formal sense. He prayed for guidance, for the strength to lead humans and direwolves alike against a foe that seemed unstoppable. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the towers, staining the sky with violent shades of orange and red, Arya caught up with Jon by the stables. He noticed a wistful sadness in her eyes. She brushed a stray strand of hair from her forehead. "Jon, do you really think we can win?" He looked at her, then gazed out over the courtyard where Duskfang and Nymeria were prowling. "I don't know," he answered honestly, "but we have to try." There's no other choice. Arya nodded, fists clenching at her sides. Then I'm glad you brought the direwolves. We need all the help we can get. The next day brought a glimmer of hope on the horizon. Daenerys Targaryen's banner appeared in the distance, borne by horsemen riding under the three-headed dragon sigil. Word soon spread. Daenerys herself had arrived. Her forces, though weary and reduced after a long campaign, were formidable. And overhead, circling in the wintry sky, soared her dragons. Drogon, Regal, and a smaller silhouette that might have been the last one, Viserion, though Jon had heard the dreaded tale that Viserion had been claimed by the Night King. Yet, from the vantage at Winterfell, he counted 2 living dragons. The third was lost beyond the wall, a horror that Jon dared not dwell on. When Daenerys's party entered the castle, there was a moment of tense silence as the direwolves regarded the dragons above with uneasy stares, and the dragons roared in the sky, perhaps smelling the strange presence below. Daenerys herself dismounted her steed, scanning the courtyard. She wore warm furs, a stark difference from her usual attire in the warmer climes. Her silver-gold hair was pulled back in braids, and her violet eyes burned with quiet determination. Tyrion Lannister, Ser Jorah Mormont, Missandei, and Grey Worm followed in her wake, each weighed by the seriousness of their mission. Jon stepped forward to greet them, Sansa at his side. Daenerys's gaze fell upon the direwolves, and her eyebrows rose. "So the rumors were true," she murmured, voice carrying a note of fascination. Jon nodded gravely. "They're with us. We fought the dead together beyond the wall. They've chosen to stand against the Night King." Daenerys studied him for a moment. There was weariness in her eyes, and something else, perhaps relief. "Then we have one more ally, one more hope," she said softly, as if the burdens of war weighed heavily on her. Tyrion sidled closer, eyeing the wolves with open curiosity. "I've never seen so many direwolves in one place. Let's hope they're more amenable to living men than your average Lannister." That brought a faint chuckle from Jon. "They don't care much for titles or bloodlines, only intent, and they know who the real enemy is." Their war council assembled in the Great Hall that evening. It was a somber gathering, with the Stark siblings, Daenerys, Tyrion, Varys, Davos Seaworth, who had arrived earlier, and several northern lords all seated around a long table. Bran Stark was there, remote and ethereal in his wheelchair, sometimes speaking in cryptic phrases that hinted at visions of the past and future. They spoke of strategy, how to position their armies, how to make use of the dragons without risking them prematurely, and how to integrate the direwolf pack into a cohesive battle plan. Arya insisted that the wolves would best be used in swift strikes, harassing the flanks of the undead army. Jon wanted them near him, to break through the lines of whites with raw ferocity. Daenerys worried about the Night King's twisted power. If he could slay dragons, what might he do to direwolves? As the discussion wore on, tension flared. Some northern lords questioned Daenerys' right to rule. Others questioned whether the dragons would burn entire cities. Daenerys, in turn, bristled at such doubts, reminding them of her sacrifice and the lengths she had gone to free the oppressed. Jon found himself playing mediator, urging everyone to remember the true enemy. The presence of the direwolves of Ghost and Duskfang seemed to quell the worst of the arguments. The old magic of the North hovered in the hall, an unspoken reminder that this was a time for unity or death. Finally, they agreed on a plan. Scouts reported that the army of the dead marched toward the last hearth, sweeping aside any stray holdfast. They expected the enemy to reach Winterfell within a fortnight. The living had that much time to prepare, to rally every spare sword and spear to these walls. Daenerys would position her dragons strategically, using them to counter any White Walkers that appeared on the battlefield. Jon, Tormund, and the direwolves would anchor the front lines, bolstered by the combined might of northern infantry and unsullied spearmen. Arya, the Hound, who had arrived with the Brotherhood, Brienne, and Jaime Lannister, another unexpected arrival, would command mobile forces within the walls, ready to respond wherever the Whites hit hardest. Night fell and the council dispersed. The final words of the meeting hung in the air like a chill omen. The Night King was near, and the greatest battle of their age was at hand. Jon found a moment alone in the Godswood, where the heart tree's face wept crimson sap. He knelt, placing a hand on the old roots that snaked across the ground. Ghost hovered nearby. Jon's breath rose in steamy plumes. He closed his eyes and tried to calm the storm of dread in his chest. So many looked to him for guidance, as king in the north, as a hero who had returned from death. But he knew better. He was just a man, flesh and blood. Yet he had these wolves. He had dragons. He had Daenerys and the North, and all those who had bent a knee or simply chosen to fight for life. For a fleeting instant, Jon felt a spark of hope. The old gods and the new might stand with them or might not. But there was no turning back. As if sensing his turmoil, Ghost pressed his head against Jon's shoulder. Jon smiled faintly and scratched the direwolf behind the ears. "We're almost out of time, Ghost," he whispered. "But at least we stand together." The next morning's dawn was gray and cold, a fitting backdrop for the days of feverish preparation that followed. Men and women trained in the courtyard, archers drilled on the walls, and the blacksmiths toiled endlessly. Tormund organized the wildlings into small, deadly squads that would move nimbly on the battlefield. Grey Worm drilled the Unsullied with steely discipline. The direwolves prowled, sometimes vanishing to hunt in the nearby forests, but always returning by dusk. Their presence alone lifted morale, or terrified those not used to such monstrous creatures. Jon spent each day in the yard, practicing swordplay with volunteers, ensuring everyone was prepared for the savagery of undead assault. He arranged for dragonglass-tipped spears and arrows, courtesy of the supplies they had mined from Dragonstone. Every able-bodied soul was fitted with at least some measure of protection. Even Gendry was there, forging plates of armor alongside the blacksmiths, sweat drenching his brow. Daenerys oversaw the placement of her dragons. She took to the skies often, scouting for signs of the enemy. Now and then, one of the dragons landed within the courtyard, massive wings stirring up whirlwinds of snow. The direwolves would scatter, growling uneasily. The tension between wolf and dragon crackled, but no outright violence erupted. It was as if each recognized the other as an ally in this existential struggle. Finally, the day arrived when a horn blast echoed from the walls, signaling the approach of something beyond the horizon. Jon and Daenerys stood on the ramparts, looking out into the bleak distance. A storm of white and gray obscured their view, but they knew what lay behind the wall of swirling snow. The Night King's legion marched. Jon's stomach churned. He turned to Daenerys, who wore an expression of quiet, grim determination. "It's time," he said simply. She nodded. "We'll hold them here. No matter what happens, the living must stand." Jon hurried down the steps to gather the direwolves. Ghost led the way, bounding through the yard. Duskfang was already assembling the rest of the pack near the northern gate. The atmosphere bristled with tension. Soldiers lined the battlements. Archers knocked arrows tipped with dragonglass. On the front lines, men and women formed tight ranks, shields up, spears at the ready. Tormund barked orders, while Davos directed the newer recruits. Grey Worm's voice cut through the cold, rallying the Unsullied into formation. Jon found Sansa and Arya near the main gate. Sansa's face was pale but resolute. Arya held a new weapon, some sort of spear-like staff fashioned by Gendry, tipped with dragonglass on one end and steel on the other. She looked ready for vengeance. The gate swung open, and Jon led the direwolves out onto the open field before Winterfell. Snow whipped around them, carried on ferocious gusts of wind. Duskfang and Nymeria trotted at the head of the pack, with Ghost just behind Jon, as if forming a protective triangle around him. Thousands of footsteps thundered across the ramparts as the living poured out to position themselves. A hush fell, so profound that Jon could hear his heartbeat. Through the swirling veil of snow, dark figures began to emerge, countless wights, a silent host of rotting flesh, shambling ever forward. Their lifeless eyes glimmered with an icy light. Above them, white walkers on dead horses observed with cruel detachment, their breath misting unnaturally in the frigid air. and above even them, high in the swirling sky, a shape of blue flame soared, a dragon with decayed flesh hanging from its frame, the Night King astride it. Viserion, once Daenerys' child, now an abomination. Fear threatened to grip every heart in Winterfell, but Jon inhaled, steeling himself. He raised Longclaw high. The direwolves growled, their throats vibrating with raw fury. Ghost's hackles rose, and a collective snarl tore through the pack. Jon spared a glance upward, seeing Daenerys mount Drogon in the courtyard. The mighty black dragon roared, a sound that shook the very stones. Rhaegal joined, taking flight in pursuit of his undead sibling. Then, as the Night King's army began its relentless advance, Jon lowered his sword in a signal. The direwolves, unleashed, thundered across the snow, howling like the embodiment of the old god's wrath. Ghost bounded at the forefront, eyes blazing scarlet, and the rest of the pack followed, a tide of fur and fang. Jon broke into a run alongside them, war cry lost in the roar of the wind. It was a sight out of legend. Direwolves and men charging side by side, determined to halt the march of death itself. In the skies, dragons clashed, fire and ice meeting in an apocalyptic dance. On the ground, the whites surged forward, weapons raised, silent but for the eerie clacking of bone and armor. When the two forces collided, the battlefield erupted in chaos. Direwolves tore into the undead ranks, snapping brittle bones and ripping apart decaying flesh. Soldiers stabbed and hacked at the whites, the clang of steel on steel melding with bestial snarls. The northern cavalry circled the edges, cutting down pockets of undead that strayed from the main horde. The White Walkers watched, then entered the fray, their chilling presence sowing dread wherever they passed. But Jon had prepared for this. He had armed his people with Valyrian steel if they had it, and dragonglass if they did not. The sky darkened under rolling clouds. Snow fell heavier, and the ground became slick with blood and ice. Direwolves lunged at the White Walkers, only to be repulsed by the unnatural cold of their blades. One walker slashed at a wolf's flank, and the beast howled in pain, collapsing in the crimson-stained snow. Another wolf tackled the walker from behind, Ghost at its side, and in a flurry of snapping jaws, the walker shattered into icy shards. Jon found himself in the thick of it. He slew white after white, Longclaw glimmering with each strike. Around him, men fell, only to rise as fresh horrors, until someone managed to burn their bodies or sever limbs. The stench of death was overpowering. He heard Tormund's bellowing war cry and the ring of Arya's staff as she shattered skulls. Somewhere above the melee, Drogon spewed flames, incinerating swathes of whites, while Rhaegal dove at the undead Viserion. The two dragons locked in a lethal dance through the storm-lashed heavens. The Night King appeared at the rear of his legion, pale and implacable. His icy blue gaze swept the battlefield. Jon's blood ran cold. He remembered the terror at Hardhome, the soundless challenge as the Night King raised the dead at his feet. This time, though, Jon was not alone. A mass of fur and fang advanced on the Night King's position. Duskfang, leading a cadre of the largest wolves, sprinted through the ranks of undead, scattering whites with savage efficiency. But the Night King lifted a withered hand. The ground trembled. Corpses of the fallen man, wolf, and beast alike began to twitch. The newly dead rose. Jon watched in horror as even direwolves that had perished were jerked upright, eyes glowing a ghostly blue, turned against their own. Duskfang hesitated for an instant, as though sensing the abomination. Before the Night King could complete his foul resurrection, a roar filled the sky. Daenerys and Drogon descended from the clouds, unleashing a torrent of dragonfire that split the storm. Flames engulfed the Night King's position, and for a moment, he disappeared in the inferno. Duskfang and the other wolves darted aside, narrowly escaping the blaze. Jon shielded his face, heat buffeting him as the snow around them hissed into steam. When the fire subsided, the Night King remained, cloaked in swirling embers, and scathed. He lifted his hands slowly, as if welcoming the flame. The air around him crackled with frosty power, and ice spears erupted from the ground, hurling toward Drogon. The massive dragon banked hard, narrowly avoiding a fatal strike, but one spear caught his flank, sending him roaring in pain. Daenerys struggled to keep her seat. With furious purpose, Jon shoved his way through the melee, screaming to his allies to distract the Whites while he advanced on the Night King. In the corner of his vision, he saw Duskfang tearing apart undead direwolves. A tragic battle of kin turned monstrous. Ghost was locked in a struggle with a White Walker, snapping at the ice blade in a lethal dance. Every inch of the battlefield was mayhem, but Jon pressed on, ignoring the pain of 1,000 small wounds. The Night King turned at Jon's approach. Their eyes locked, a repetition of that dreadful confrontation beyond the wall. But Jon was different now. He had men and wolves at his back. He had a reason to fight that transcended his own life. Lifting Longclaw, he charged with a cry that tore from his very soul. The Night King met his blade with an ice sword of his own, the clash sending shockwaves of cold and sparks. Jon grunted as the numbing chill snaked up his arms, but he refused to falter. He struck again and again, each blow deflected with preternatural speed. Shadows danced around them, lit by the flickering glow of dragonfire. Whites lunged at Jon's flanks, only to be ripped away by direwolves that darted in to protect him. Time lost meaning as the two locked swords. The Night King lashed out with inhuman strength, nearly knocking Longclaw from Jon's hands. Jon staggered, knee hitting the icy ground. The Night King raised his blade for a killing blow. A blur of fur smashed into the Night King's side. Duskfang slammed its massive body into the undead sovereign, snapping at his arm. The Night King twisted impossibly, driving an elbow of jagged ice into the wolf's side. A sickening crunch echoed, and Duskfang yelped, blood staining its dark fur. Yet the alpha wolf's attack had given Jon the moment he needed. Jon rose with a snarl, channeling everything he had into a mighty slash. Longclaw's Valyrian steel cut into the Night King's torso. For an instant, the creature's form shimmered, cracking like a mirror. The Night King released a soundless shriek of pure hatred. Jon drove the blade deeper. A surge of white mist erupted around them, and the Night King exploded in a shower of ice crystals, carried away on the wind. It was done. The Night King was vanquished, his hold on the undead severed in the blink of an eye. All across the battlefield, Whites collapsed into piles of lifeless flesh and bone. The White Walkers shattered like glass statues. The Dragon Viserion, once locked in aerial combat with Regal, disintegrated in a storm of icy fragments, leaving behind only the memory of what it had been. Silence fell, broken only by ragged breathing, the crackle of dying flames, and the anguished moans of the wounded. Jon stood there, Longclaw still raised, hardly believing what had transpired. The swirling snow abated, as if the storm had been bound to the Night King's will. The sun broke through, a faint, cold light illuminating the field of slaughter. He rushed to Duskfang, who lay panting in the red-stained snow. The alpha wolf's flank was torn open, blood matting the thick fur. Jon sank to his knees, pressing a hand against the wound, his voice choked. Ghost approached, sniffing anxiously. Other direwolves formed a circle around them, some wounded themselves but standing guard. "Hold on," Jon whispered, tears mingling with the melting snow on his cheeks. "You fought so bravely. Just hold on." But Duskfang's eyes were half-lidded, breath shallow. The wolf let out a soft rumble, almost a gentle purr of acknowledgement. In that fleeting moment, Jon felt an indescribable bond, as though their spirits touched. Duskfang's gaze flicked to Ghost, then back to Jon, and the alpha's breathing slowed. With a final exhalation, the wolf's body went still. Jon bowed his head, grief tearing at his heart. The direwolves, sensing the loss of their alpha, raised their muzzles to the sky and unleashed a mournful howl that carried across the field and echoed through Winterfell's broken gates. That haunting cry was answered by living men and women who had survived the onslaught, by dragons overhead who roared their lament, and by the wind that once more swept over the battlements. The war was over, or so it seemed in that moment. The Night King was gone, his armies destroyed. Countless dead littered the field, men and wolves alike. Yet life still endured. Jon Snow, kneeling beside the fallen Alpha, felt the weight of that victory and the cost it exacted. The Direwolf pack, though diminished, had kept its unspoken promise. They had fought for the living, forging a legend that would never be forgotten. As the sun rose higher, casting warm rays on the blood-soaked snow, Jon realized that the living had truly prevailed. Ghost pressed against him, silent but alive, a reminder that hope still remained. The memory of Duskfang's sacrifice would guide them forward. And in that hush of dawn, Jon Snow lifted his tear-streaked face to the sky, silently vowing that he would spend whatever days he had left ensuring that no threat like the Night King ever rose again. For there was always a new dawn, always a chance to heal and rebuild. The wolves would remain in the north, an ever-present testament to an age-old bond between man and beast. And as the days turned to weeks and the land slowly recovered, the songs and stories spread far and wide. Of Jon Snow, the White Wolf, who led an army of direwolves to rival the Night King's horde, and how their valor, claws, and teeth helped deliver Westeros from the long night. Jon Snow stood on the reddened field before Winterfell, the early morning sun casting pale rays through the lingering haze of the recent battle. The Night King's death had brought a hush upon the north, an end to the war of ice and death that had nearly consumed them all. The snow was stained with blood, and the air smelled of smoke, steel, and the bitter tang of loss. Whites lay in heaps where they had fallen, silent and broken, no longer puppets of the ancient dark magic that had animated them. The living moved among them, wildlings, northerners unsullied, checking for survivors, gathering bodies for pyres or burial. Nearby, a pack of direwolves lingered around their fallen alpha, Duskfang, who had died helping Jon deliver the final blow against the Night King. Ghost, the white-furred companion who had been with Jon since the beginning, sat close by, ears flattened in grief. Blood matted Ghost's thick fur where a shallow slash had torn his flank. Jon knelt between the wolves, one hand resting on Duskfang's still-warm pelt, the other gently stroking Ghost's neck. The rest of the direwolves radiated a collective sorrow, their heads lowered, their luminous eyes fixed upon the one who would never rise again. Softly, almost reverently, Jon rose and placed his palm on Duskfang's massive shoulder. He gazed at the beast's features, thick black fur streaked with silver, a muzzle lined with scars earned through countless battles, and eyes that had once glowed with fierce intelligence. Now that light was extinguished. Jon's throat tightened as he remembered how Duskfang had interceded at the last moment. That quick, brutal tackle giving Jon the chance to strike the Night King. Without Duskfang's intervention, he might have died. The cost of victory was high, but it was not in vain. Jon lifted his eyes, scanning the horizon. The wind had died to a breeze, and the storm clouds that had once churned under the Night King's power were dissipating. Now the first hints of true morning broke through, an echo of hope. He inhaled slowly, letting the frigid air fill his lungs. The immediate threat was gone, and yet he felt no sense of peace. A new restlessness knotted in his chest. Westeros was not united. The realm had faced many perils before, and it would again. If they did not mend old wounds, if the lords of the Seven Kingdoms did not truly stand together, how long before another tyrant rose, or another war threatened the realm's fragile peace? There was a rustle of movement. Tormund Giantsbane approached, bloodied but grinning. That was some fight, Jon Snow. A shame about the big wolf, but he died a hero's death. You had me worried, thought you might be done for. But you're still here, so maybe the gods haven't had enough of you yet. Jon managed a faint half-smile, though it felt forced. Seems not. He glanced again at Duskfang's body. The rest of the direwolves crowded closer, occasionally licking at the fallen alpha's muzzle, as though trying to rouse him. We'll bury him properly. He saved us all. Tormund reached out, giving Jon a firm clasp on the shoulder. We will. The free folk owe you and your wolves a great debt. Now come on, let's see to the living. Jon nodded, his chest heavy with sorrow. He made a gentle gesture to Ghost, who rose and limped behind him. The pack followed, some of them pausing uncertainly beside Duskfang, but eventually they all fell into step, as though accepting that life continued. For now, they would carry on without their alpha. Winterfell's courtyard lay open and chaotic. Fires burned in iron braziers, warming the wounded as best they could. The castle's great gates stood half-splintered from the assault. Tents of various shapes and sizes had been erected hastily to shelter those who could no longer fit in the castle halls. Within the keep, Daenerys Targaryen tended to Drogon's wounds, aided by healers who had never expected to treat a dragon. Rhaegal circled overhead, letting out the occasional roar that reverberated through the battered towers. Sansa Stark and Arya had taken charge of organizing the aftermath, distributing food, caring for the wounded, and ensuring that none of the corpses had escaped the final unbinding. Davos Seaworth stood by them, issuing quiet instructions, while Brienne of Tarth patrolled the perimeter. The exhaustion that clung to everyone's faces was profound, but there was an undeniable spark of triumph in the air. They had beaten the Night King. The impossible had been made real. Jon walked among them, offering words of gratitude or solace where he could. Soldiers from House Mormont, House Glover, House Royce, and many other northern families lined the grounds. A hush fell wherever Jon passed, for he was not just king in the north now. He was the man who had ended the threat of the White Walkers. People looked at him with awe, though he wore it like a burdensome cloak. The direwolves trailing him only heightened the sense of mystery and reverence. Soon, Jon found Daenerys in a quiet corner of the courtyard. She was removing bits of metal shrapnel from Drogon's scales, her own hands slick with dragon blood. Her face was streaked with ash and tears. Tyrion stood nearby, silent, his normally sharp eyes clouded with exhaustion. When Daenerys glanced up and saw Jon, her expression softened. She stepped away from Drogon, who moaned, eyelids drooping with pain and fatigue. "You did it," Daenerys said, her voice trembling. "The Night King is gone." Jon nodded. "Thanks to all of us. If you and Drogon hadn't come when you did." He trailed off, remembering how the dragonfire had distracted the Night King at the critical moment. Daenerys's gaze flicked to the direwolves at Jon's side. Some of them, uneasy around the dragon's presence, paced in restless arcs, their hackles raised. Ghost, for his part, stood firm, as though refusing to show fear. "Your wolves fought bravely," Daenerys said, "and paid a heavy price." Jon's throat tightened once more at the thought of Duskfang. "I'll see them honored." Tyrion cleared his throat, stepping forward. "Well, we can toast them properly once we've finished putting out fires and seeing to the wounded. Another great war has ended, and I suppose now we must deal with the next crisis. Namely, whether the lords of Westeros will unite behind us or tear each other apart. Or us." Jon's expression hardened. He had not forgotten the precarious state of the realm. Though the greatest existential threat was ended, Cersei Lannister's hold on King's Landing, and the Southern Lords' varying allegiances, hung over them. "We have to decide the future," Jon said quietly. "Daenerys fought with us against the dead. She has proven she's willing to defend the realm. If the Lords can't see that, then we'll find another way." Daenerys studied him for a moment. In her eyes flickered a trace of warmth, but also a deep weariness. "I came to break the wheel," she murmured. "Yet sometimes it feels the wheel only tightens. We'll face whatever comes. Together. For now, let's take care of our wounded." Jon inclined his head. "Aye, that comes first. Then we talk about what happens next." Days passed in a haze of recovery and mourning. Pyres were built for the fallen, including a special one for Duskfang. The direwolves gathered in a solemn half-ring as Jon, Sansa, Arya, and a few wildling shamans lit the pyre in the godswood. The flames licked at the alpha's dark fur, turning it to dancing embers. Arya stood close, silent tears running down her cheeks. Nymeria, her own lost direwolf who had returned with the pack, nuzzled Arya's hand in consolation. Ghost sat unmoving by Jon's side, ears back, eyes reflecting the flickering orange glow. The ceremony was simple yet profound. Even men and women who had feared the giant beasts bowed their heads in respect for Duskfang's courage. Jon watched the fire climb higher, the heat singing his face. He felt a pang that was part sadness, part admiration. Duskfang's sacrifice symbolized the cost of saving the world of men, and perhaps it was the impetus Jon needed to accept that he could not simply return to the shadows. The realm demanded leadership, unity, someone to hold the North and beyond together in the face of future threats. When the pyre finally died down to embers and ash, the direwolves tilted their heads back, howling a lament that carried through Winterfell's courtyard and out over the frosted battlements. Men shivered at the sound, more chilling than any horn. Jon felt it reverberate in his bones. Maybe it was an omen or a call to the old gods. Maybe it was the wolves themselves bidding farewell to one era and calling forth the next. In the following weeks, the snows began to thaw. The unnatural, choking storm that had blanketed the north under the Night King's influence seemed to lessen. Some said that winter might soon break, though no one dared speak that hope aloud too confidently. The realm was still in winter's grip, but there was a sense that life could once again triumph. Jon busied himself with reorganizing defenses, ensuring the wildlings who had fought with him had a place to stay. Daenerys, for her part, oversaw the healing of Drogon. Though the dragon had been severely wounded by an ice spear, it had missed vital organs, and Drogon's monstrous vitality began to reassert itself. Slowly, he regained the ability to fly short distances, though each flight left him panting. Rhaegal, too, bore cuts and scorches, but he was recovering more quickly. Farther south, reports trickled in that Cersei still held the Iron Throne, though her forces were weakened. Euron Greyjoy had vanished, some claimed, retreating to the Iron Islands. Others said he had been killed in a skirmish, leaving the alliance with Cersei tenuous. Meanwhile, many lords in the Reach and the Stormlands were unsure which side to align with. The threat from the north that they had so long denied was gone, at least so they believed for the moment. Westeros was ripe for another conflict, for half the armies that once marched with Daenerys had been lost to the battle against the dead, and the north was exhausted from years of war. Yet there was a new factor that no one, not even Daenerys, had fully anticipated: the Direwolf pack. They had fought for the living and had proven themselves a terrifying force. Legends spread like wildfire. Peasants gossiped about men who rode direwolves as tall as horses, tearing through whites as though they were made of paper. Some said Jon Snow was a demigod of the old gods, come to pass judgment on the faithless. Whispers grew that the direwolves would follow only him, that he could command them with a mere glance. Jon did not precisely command them in the way a lord commands troops. The wolves were no mindless beasts, but they did heed his presence, ghosting at his side, hunting in coordinated packs, standing guard when he patrolled the lands around Winterfell. Ghost still served as the closest companion, though Nymeria would often join them, and the rest of the pack had begun to accept Jon's leadership after Duskfang's death. Rumors reached as far as the Riverlands. A group of sellswords from Essos, crossing near Moat Cailin, claimed to have encountered the direwolves. Terrified, they surrendered before a single blow was struck. The wildlings who traveled with the wolves, loyal now to Jon Snow, escorted the sellswords to Winterfell, where they arrived with trembling knees and swore fealty. The presence of these giant beasts shattered the usual cycle of conflict and attrition, presenting a fearsome deterrent that could not be easily matched. Daenerys saw the shift. She understood the power a single direwolf had on the battlefield. An entire pack multiplied that tenfold. Yet she also recognized that Jon had the unwavering trust of these creatures in a way no one else did. She spoke with him often in hushed corners of the castle. "Westeros is fractured," she said one evening, her voice echoing gently against the stone walls. "We have an opportunity to end the chaos, if we unite the realm under one just leader." Jon, who had come to respect her willpower and vision, also bristled at the word conquest. He had seen enough war, but he remembered the letter from the Riverlands, where outlaws terrorized villages that had barely survived the winter, and he realized that if there was no central authority, common folk would suffer. "We ended one nightmare," Jon said, gazing at the faint light of a torch on the wall. If we turn a blind eye to the rest, what did we truly save them for? Daenerys reached for his hand. When I spoke of breaking the wheel, I envisioned a better world. No more lords squabbling for a throne while the small folk starve. A note of urgency entered her voice. But to do that, we must first ensure stability. Jon exhaled. Aye. The question is, will the realm accept you? After all these battles, many still fear a Targaryen on the throne. She squared her shoulders. They will accept it if we prove we are here to protect them. If we show them a better future. You've seen how quickly men bend the knee to fear, Jon. But you've also seen how they rally behind true hope. If I go south, it might be another war. But if you ride with me, if you bring the North and these direwolves, perhaps we can make them see reason without as much bloodshed. Jon glanced out of a narrow slit of a window, where the moonlight painted the distant courtyard in silver. He considered the pack that roamed the walls, the newly awakened power that had rallied to him. He remembered the vow he made at the pyre, to honor the fallen and protect the living. I never wanted to conquer anything, he murmured. But the realm does need a protector. If they won't listen to words, maybe the sight of the wolves will remind them of the cost of defiance. And more importantly, show them there's a new force in the land that can't be bought or intimidated. Daenerys squeezed his hand. We'll do it together. The next morning, they convened in the Great Hall. Sansa sat at the high table, Arya beside her, while Bran watched from his wheeled chair, calm and inscrutable. The northern lords, some still battered and weary from the battle with the Night King, listened as Jon spoke of forging a new unity. Daenerys, flanked by Tyrion, explained her desire to bring the realm under a single banner, to feed the starving, to rebuild roads and cities, to ensure no child ever faced the terror of the undead again. Some listened with open ears. Others bristled at the idea of bowing to a Targaryen queen. But then Arya spoke up, her voice as cold and sharp as ice. She stood with us when no one else believed. She burned the whites alongside us. If we can trust dragons, we can trust her. Sansa added her own support, though her gaze was more measured. Winterfell stands because we worked together. The North cannot remain isolated, or we risk facing future threats alone. We must shape the realm, rather than be shaped by it. Bran said little, but at one point, he fixed his eerie eyes on the assembly and remarked, all that was and all that will be rests on choices made now. His words hung in the hall like a prophecy. In the end, the northern lords agreed to support a cautious campaign south, though they refused to call it conquest. They preferred to think of it as ensuring the realm's safety, rooting out those who would perpetuate the chaos. Many lords insisted Jon remain the king in the north, but Jon shook his head, glancing at Daenerys. We'll see how the realm responds. First, let us bring them peace. Within a fortnight, Daenerys's host and the northern banners began to assemble anew. The surviving Unsullied formed a disciplined corps, though their numbers were greatly reduced. The wildlings, under Tormund's boisterous command, declared they would follow Jon just for the fun of it. The northern knights, mindful of ancient loyalties, mustered alongside a handful of southerners who had sided with Daenerys earlier. In total, it was not a vast army, but it was formidable enough, especially when combined with 2 living dragons and a pack of direwolves that had swelled in number. Indeed, the direwolf pack had grown. Perhaps it was the promise of abundant prey, or the rumors of the free-ranging forest near Winterfell. Perhaps the old gods themselves willed it. More young wolves had joined, until nearly 4 dozen prowled the perimeter of the castle's lands, answering Ghost's silent leadership and Jon's presence. They were not domesticated, none dared approach them carelessly, but they were clearly allied, bounding along in hunts, forming patrols around the encampment. Sometimes, in the dead of night, their howls wove a tapestry of sound that both comforted the loyal and terrified any potential foe. When the hour came to depart, the massive host poured out of Winterfell's gates. Sansa stayed behind, serving as Warden of the North, ensuring that the seat of House Stark remained guarded. She bid Jon a tearful farewell, wishing him luck and caution. Arya decided to ride with Jon, determined to see the realm with her own eyes once more and to keep her skills honed. They took the King's Road, as broken and snow-drifted as it was, forging south toward Moat Cailin. The sight of so many direwolves padding alongside the column of soldiers was a sight out of legend. Common folk gathered at a distance to watch, some bowing or kneeling. Whispers of the wolves of winter spread quickly. Jon felt a responsibility in it, a weight that pressed down on him each time he spied the fearful or hopeful faces of villagers. Daenerys rode near the front, flanked by Jorah Mormont and Grey Worm. Tyrion and Varys traveled in a small wagon, poring over maps and occasionally muttering about the realm's politics. Tormund led the wildlings in his usual chaotic style, though they seemed more disciplined than before, many of them forging friendships with northern knights. The dragons flew overhead in slow arcs, their majestic forms casting shadows on the ground. They encountered their first challenge at the Neck. A local lord, sworn to Cersei's cause in some confusion of loyalties, had mustered a small force to block the path south. His men stood behind crude barricades, wearing battered armor. Their leader, a stocky fellow with a patchy beard, attempted to demand that Daenerys turn back. Before Jon could even respond, Ghost emerged from the surrounding pines, accompanied by a half-dozen direwolves, all baring their teeth. A hush fell over the defenders. Their faces went pale as they stared at the giant wolves. Then, as Drogon passed overhead with a thunderous roar, they dropped their weapons and fled. The local lord himself surrendered on his knees. Jon dismounted, telling the wolves to stand down with a calm gesture. Ghost and the others obeyed, though they still growled low in their throats. Jon offered the terrified lord a chance to stand. "You owe no debt to Cersei. She has abandoned the realm to war. Join us or return to your lands peacefully. But do not stand in our way." The lord, trembling, promptly swore fealty to Jon and Daenerys. It was a bloodless capitulation, and Tyrion observed it keenly, remarking, "Fear can accomplish in moments what negotiation might take months to secure. Useful, but dangerous." Daenerys looked thoughtful, remembering the chaos in Essos when she had freed the slaves and then struggled to govern. "We must be cautious not to rule by terror alone." Yet the success in the Neck proved a harbinger. As the host continued, more and more lesser lords knelt without a fight, awed by the sight of dragons and direwolves side by side. The small folk, already hammered by years of war and bad harvests, were eager for peace, and they saw Daenerys and Jon as the best hope for stability. Word eventually reached King's Landing of an approaching combined northern royal host, monstrous wolves in its vanguard, dragons in the sky. Cersei Lannister's spies brought conflicting tales. Some said the new army was unstoppable. Others insisted it was a ragged bunch of northerners limping south. Cersei dismissed the more outlandish rumors. But as the weeks wore on, even she could not deny that the tide was turning. Houses that had once stood by the crown were sending ravens pledging loyalty to Daenerys Targaryen and Jon Snow. Near Harrenhal, the first true engagement occurred. A large force of Lannister men, bolstered by mercenaries left over from Euron's old alliances, attempted to bar the passage across the river. The confrontation happened at dawn. Jon led a scouting party of wolves to inspect the fortifications, discovering that the enemy had seized a strong defensive position among the ruins. Harrenhal's great black towers loomed overhead, a place steeped in ill fortune. Daenerys wanted to use the dragons to burn the mercenaries out, but Jon argued for caution. "I don't want to slaughter them if they can be turned to our side or made to surrender. We're here to unify, not to repeat old cycles of blood." So they sent forward an envoy under a banner of parley. The mercenary captain, a leathery-faced man with cunning eyes, sneered at the notion of surrender. "We're paid well by the Queen in King's Landing. You won't buy us so easily." Tormund, scowling, offered his own brand of diplomacy by letting out a booming laugh. "Gold? Jon Snow gave up a kingdom once for the good of his people. He doesn't need your gold. But you might need all the luck in the world to face these beasts." He gestured, and from behind a tumbled tower, Ghost and a dozen direwolves padded into view, silent as death. Their eyes gleamed in the early light, their breath pluming in the chill air. Even the mercenaries, hardened from years of fighting in Essos, faltered at the sight. Many had never encountered direwolves, let alone an entire pack. Still, the captain stood defiant until Daenerys arrived on Drogon's back, the dragon setting down with a thunderous impact that shook the earth. She gazed at the mercenaries with quiet contempt. "One chance," she told them. "Lay down your arms and go free, or swear loyalty to the realm and help rebuild it." The captain's courage wavered. He glanced between the glaring maw of Drogon, the rows of fangs in the direwolf's jaws, and the army of knights behind them. In that moment, perhaps he decided no amount of coin was worth becoming ashes. He knelt and his men followed, and so Harrenhal fell without significant bloodshed. Jon's host took what supplies they needed and left a garrison behind to ensure peace. More mercenaries trickled in daily, each one telling tales of how swiftly the North and the Targaryen queen were consolidating power. At every step, Daenerys insisted on distributing food to the common folk, forging alliances with local leaders, promising them fair treatment. Jon aided her, ensuring that the wolves did not become a terrorizing factor but a deterrent. To some, the dire wolves became a symbol of justice, an ancient power that would punish tyrants or brigands who preyed upon the weak. Indeed, a few times, Jon dispatched smaller packs to hunt down marauders who roamed the roads. In such cases, word soon spread that a single direwolf had brought down 3 outlaws, or that a group of them had cornered an entire bandit troop until the soldiers arrived to take them prisoner. By the time they reached the Trident, the realm was abuzz with talk of a bloodless conquest. It was not entirely bloodless, of course. Skirmishes flared here and there, some lords attempted ambushes, and men died. But the scale of violence was far less than any previous war for the throne. Fear of dragons, bolstered by the unmistakable presence of direwolves, drove the hesitant to negotiate rather than fight. Many recalled how the Starks had built the North on pacts and loyalty, and how the Targaryens had once forged the 7 kingdoms in Dragonfire. Now, it seemed a new alliance of Stark and Targaryen might unify the realm again. Still, King's Landing loomed ahead, with Cersei Lannister perched on the Iron Throne. Though her power base had eroded, she remained cunning and ruthless. She had gathered what remained of the Crownland's forces, as well as the City Watch, to defend the capital. The Golden Company, once a fearsome army of seasoned sellswords, had largely abandoned her cause after hearing of the forces arrayed against them. However, a fraction remained loyal, perhaps hoping for some final payday or a miracle. Jon knew the approach to King's Landing would be the crux of their campaign. He worried about innocent lives if a siege dragged on, or if Cersei used citizens as hostages. He worried about Daenerys' anger, her desire to break all resistance. He saw in her eyes a certain hardness that had grown since the war against the dead, the memory of dragons dying, of her people bleeding. She wanted to avoid devastation, but also refused to yield again. They halted at a position north of the city, the blackened remnants of the war camp from her previous siege attempt. Daenerys surveyed the familiar ground, her expression tense. The spiked scorpion ballistae that once lined the walls were still there, though many were in disrepair. She turned to Jon, Grey Worm, and Tyrion. "If we go in with dragons blazing, the city might burn." "I won't have that." Jon nodded, relieved. A siege could starve the people. Tyrion tapped a finger to his lip. "We need to undermine Cersei's authority. Show the people she's already lost. If the city turns against her, she'll have no choice but to surrender." That evening, Jon set out with a small cadre, Ghost, Nymeria, and a handful of the stealthiest wolves, accompanied by Arya, the Hound, and a few seasoned scouts. They skirted around the city walls under cover of darkness. Like shadows, they slipped through unguarded sections of the old outer defenses. King's Landing was not the same shining capital as before. Years of war had left the city worn and the populace wary. Rumors of plague and hunger festered within its walls. They reached Flea Bottom under the cover of moonlight. There, among the narrow alleyways, Jon saw the reality of the capital's suffering. Children huddled by guttering fires, beggars with hollowed eyes, broken cobblestones littered with refuse. The gold cloaks patrolled, but half-heartedly, and the watchmen often turned a blind eye if bribed. Arya guided them through side streets, her memory from previous visits and her training in stealth invaluable. The direwolves ghosted along, unsettling the local dogs into barking fits. Before dawn, they had posted messages at key points in the city, proclaiming that Daenerys Targaryen and Jon Snow offered bread instead of blood, justice instead of fear. The words declared that the realm was uniting behind them, that the city need only open its gates to be spared. Though it was a subtle tactic, the presence of actual direwolves lurking in the dark gave weight to the threat. The small folk awakened to see these mysterious parchments, reading them by dawn light. Word spread quickly, spurred by rumor that men had glimpsed giant wolves stalking the streets at night. The city stirred with murmurs of discontent against Cersei. Ration lines were long, taxes were high. The queen had not protected them from the undead, and now she seemed poised to drag them into another war. As the day wore on, scattered protests flared, fueled by the infiltration of loyal agents who carried Daenerys' message. Some city watch officers refused to quell the crowds. By midday, a tense calm settled. The gates remained barred, and Cersei's banners still flew from the Red Keep. But the city watch was divided. Many of the rank and file had lost faith in their queen. The grim presence of the mountain, her monstrous champion, still frightened some into obedience, but the unraveling was evident. In the fields outside the city, Daenerys mustered her host, the dragons perched on a ridge. Jon stood at her side, Ghost sitting on his haunches, Nymeria lurking just behind. The rest of the wolves were arrayed in a wide semicircle, watched closely by the men. Trumpets blared from the city walls, but no massed force emerged. As the sun dipped low, a single rider came forth under a white flag. It was Qyburn, once Cersei's advisor, now looking pallid and anxious. He approached Daenerys and Jon, eyes flicking nervously to the dragons and direwolves. Her Grace, Queen Cersei Lannister, demands to know your terms. Daenerys' voice was resolute. She must renounce her claim to the Iron Throne and submit to the realm's decision. She will stand trial for her crimes, including the use of wildfire against her own people. Qyburn sputtered. Her Grace will never accept such humiliating terms. She has the mountain. She has loyal soldiers. Fewer each day, Jon said, watching Qyburn with calm intensity. The city is on the brink of open revolt. There need not be any further bloodshed. Qyburn shuddered. Your direwolves may frighten the peasants, but the Red Keep will stand. Her Grace has no reason to yield. Daenerys' eyes blazed with a hint of fury. Does she think the Red Keep can stand against Dragonflame? Against the entire North? The people of King's Landing have suffered enough. We offer a peaceful resolution. Take it back to her. Qyburn bowed stiffly, though fear contorted his features. He turned his horse and rode back inside. The gates closed once again. That night, the city roiled with rumor. Some said the queen would unleash wildfire again, destroying King's Landing rather than surrender. Others insisted she had an alliance with unseen Essosi armies. But each rumor was met with the stark reality that Daenerys had 2 dragons, and the North had an army of direwolves. Mothers clutched their children, desperate to avoid another cataclysmic sack of the city. Then, just before dawn, a series of shrill whistles echoed from the city walls. Shapes moved on the ramparts, silhouettes of the city watch turning on each other. Some locked the gates against Cersei's loyal men, while others tried to hold the gates closed to prevent the host outside from entering. A scuffle turned into an outright fight. Jon, Daenerys, and their commanders hurried to the front lines, unsure what to expect. Ghost and Nymeria pressed in close, tails high, sensing the tension. The first rays of the sun broke over the horizon, illuminating chaos atop the walls. Shouts carried down, "Open the gates! The queen is mad! Treason!" Suddenly, the portcullis groaned and began to rise. The thick wooden gates swung outward. Jon glimpsed lines of gold cloaks struggling, some wrestling over the chains, others cheering. A few bodies tumbled from the battlements. Daenerys and Jon exchanged a look. Tormund hefted his battle axe. "Looks like the gate's open, but it may be a trap." Daenerys pursed her lips. "If it is, we'll answer in kind. But I suspect this is a mutiny from within." She and Jon advanced cautiously. The direwolves followed, and behind them the ranks of Unsullied and Northern Knights marched in measured steps. Within the city gate, they found a contingent of gold cloaks kneeling or laying down arms. Their captain, a young man with a bruised temple, struggled to speak. "We've had enough. Enough of her cruelty," he gasped, nodding toward the Red Keep. "We won't see the city burn." Jon signaled the men to stand. "Then stand aside. Let us end this without burning your home." The city watch parted, allowing Jon and Daenerys' forces to enter King's Landing. The arrival of the direwolves caused many onlookers to shrink back against the walls, though a few children gawked in wide-eyed wonder. Ghost and Nymeria led the pack in disciplined lines, as though reading Jon's intent to maintain order. The soldiers followed, banners of the Stark Wolf and the Targaryen dragon fluttering in the dawn breeze. With surprising swiftness, they seized control of the main thoroughfares. Daenerys dispatched small squads to secure the granaries and the city's main squares, distributing bread and water to the crowds. Jon ordered the direwolves to patrol in pairs, ensuring no pockets of loyalist forces could regroup. A hush of uncertainty fell over the city, cut by occasional cheers when the small folk realized a new power had arrived, and that they were not simply looting or pillaging. The Red Keep loomed overhead. Within its high walls, Cersei Lannister still presided, though her court was in tatters. The Mountain stood guard at her side, a towering figure of death. Qyburn hovered behind her with watery eyes. A handful of Lannister soldiers, perhaps a few hundred, remained loyal or too frightened to betray her. Daenerys and Jon advanced on the keep, accompanied by Grey Worm, Arya, Tyrion, and a formidable wedge of troops. Drogon and Rhaegal circled the skies overhead. Ghost and Nymeria prowled at the flanks, the rest of the direwolves fanning out behind them. It was a display of overwhelming might. On the ramparts of the keep, archers readied arrows, ballistae operators prepared to fire. But their hearts were not in it. They could see the city below, already largely in the hands of the invaders, who had not resorted to mass violence. Cersei, her golden hair disheveled, her face twisted with rage and desperation, yelled commands, but the men hesitated. Then, in an act of defiance or madness, Cersei ordered a volley loosed. Arrows rained down, clattering on shields, some striking men or direwolves. One wolf yelped and fell, an arrow in its shoulder, but Grey Worm and his Unsullied swiftly covered the distance, raising shields overhead and returning fire with dragonglass-tipped arrows that frightened the defenders into ducking behind crenellations. The ballista crews tried to aim at the dragons, but Rhaegal banked away, unleashing a warning roar that shook the battlements. The final confrontation came swiftly. A battered gate stood between the courtyard and the throne room. Cersei's last loyal soldiers mustered behind it. Jon and Grey Worm led a charge that battered down the door. The direwolves poured through the breach, scattering the defenders in moments. Ghost tackled a man who tried to stab Jon from behind, while Nymeria lunged at another who was raising a crossbow. The soldier, seeing the monstrous wolf, dropped his weapon and flung himself face-first on the floor, screaming a surrender. Cersei retreated up the Red Keep's grand steps, the mountain looming behind her like a black sentinel. Her eyes darted wildly, and she clenched her fists. When the throne room doors burst open, she was there, in front of the Iron Throne, refusing to flee. She had lost everything but her pride. Daenerys and Jon entered, swords drawn, their retinue at their backs. The mountain stepped forward, sword raised. Arya hissed under her breath, stepping into a fighting stance, but the hound was faster. He let out a guttural snarl, his old hatred for the mountain blazing in his eyes. They met in a brutal clash, steel ringing on steel. The mountain's strength was immense, but the hound fought with savage determination. Cersei stood to the side, breathing heavily, her gaze flicking around for a means of escape. Tyrion stepped forward, arms raised. "It's over, Cersei. Let it end." She spat at him, tears cutting tracks through the grime on her cheeks. "Traitor," she hissed. "You've ruined everything." Jon said nothing, blade lowered. He could not help but remember the horrors that had come from her reign. The realm's divisions, the countless lives lost. "Cersei Lannister, surrender. Stand trial for your crimes. Or fight if you must. But this ends now." Her trembling lips curled into a mocking grin. "I am the queen," she whispered. "This throne is mine by right of conquest, by law, by the blood of those who opposed me." Daenerys's voice rang out, cold and final. "Not anymore." Before Cersei could retort, the hound forced the mountain onto one knee with a fierce blow. Sparks flew from the mountain's armor. Then, with a roar, the hound plunged his sword into his brother's visor. The monstrous knight twitched, let out a wheezing hiss, and collapsed onto the floor. Smoke rose from the gaping wound in his helmet, as if some unnatural sorcery had finally been broken. The hound staggered back, breath ragged, eyes ablaze with grim triumph. Cersei stumbled, cornered against the throne's dais. Soldiers rushed in from behind, capturing the last of the Lannister loyalists. Ghost padded forward, teeth bared, and Cersei recoiled, letting out a strangled sound. Tyrion stared at her with a mixture of pity and condemnation. "You brought us all to this moment, sister. If only you had turned your pride aside." She sank to her knees, face twisted with defiance even in defeat. "Burn in the seven hells," she spat. "All of you." Two Unsullied seized her arms, forcing her to stand. Daenerys regarded her with an icy calm. "We will not punish the city for your crimes. You will be tried fairly for all that you have done. The age of unchecked tyranny is over." Cersei's screams of protest echoed in the cavernous throne room as she was dragged away. Tyrion watched, expression bleak. Jon turned his gaze to the Iron Throne, a hulking mass of twisted steel that seemed to reflect centuries of bloodshed and power struggles. Daenerys walked slowly toward it, her footsteps echoing on the marble floor. She reached out, fingers brushing the cold metal. This was the seat of kings and queens, a symbol of endless wars. She did not sit. Instead, she turned to Jon, expression solemn. "The realm is free of the Night King and of Cersei, but we have much work to do. This throne has caused too much pain. Maybe it's time we choose a better way." Jon, hand still resting on the hilt of Longclaw, nodded. He felt the eyes of those gathered upon him. Arya, Tyrion, the Hound, Grey Worm, even the direwolves who stood at the threshold. "We must restore order, feed the people, and ensure no one else can tear the realm apart for a seat of knives." Daenerys nodded. "Let the throne remain as a symbol of the past, but we can build a new seat, a new capital if we must. One that does not carry the weight of thousands of corpses." The vow hung in the air. Soldiers and onlookers alike felt a ripple of astonishment. Destroy the Iron Throne, or leave it as a relic? No matter the details, it was clear that Daenerys Targaryen and Jon Snow were forging a different path. In the days that followed, the city breathed a collective sigh of relief. Bread was distributed, water sources secured, and order restored under a new watch loyal to Daenerys and Jon. The direwolves patrolled the streets in small groups, a chilling reminder that the new regime would not tolerate lawlessness. People spoke of how the wolves never attacked the innocent, only those who threatened children or tried to harm others. It was a curious, almost mystical sense of justice. Cersei languished in the dungeons, awaiting a formal trial. The lords of Westeros began to arrive in the capital, summoned to witness the crowning of new leadership. Some came eagerly, some grudgingly, but nearly all came. House Tyrell's remnants, the Martells of Dorne, the Greyjoys of the Iron Islands, the Baratheon lines from Storm's End, the Vale under Lord Royce, and so on. They found King's Landing changed, quieter, overshadowed by the presence of dragons perched on the city walls and direwolves roaming the thoroughfares. In the Red Keep's Great Hall, Daenerys and Jon held court together. She refused to sit on the Iron Throne, so they took seats on simpler chairs, placed near the foot of the dais. Tyrion served as hand of the queen, scribbling notes and drafting laws. Varys lingered near, discreetly listening for whispers of dissent. Sansa arrived from the north, representing House Stark, while Arya hovered like a wraith, always near her siblings but never quite part of the pageantry. Bran remained in Winterfell, too frail to travel, but sending messages through ravens. The lords were confronted with a new reality. A Targaryen queen who had risked everything to fight the dead, a Stark king who commanded an army of direwolves, and the memory of horrors beyond the wall that still lingered in their minds. Over weeks of negotiations, some knelt, some swore oaths reluctantly, but nearly all recognized that united rule was the only path that could prevent future calamities. Daenerys announced an intention to break the old feudal system. She spoke of appointing regional councils, ensuring that taxation was fair, that justice was dispensed equitably. Jon supported her, vowing that the North would remain part of the realm under a shared banner, with the right to manage its own affairs so long as it did not break from the greater unity. It was a compromise that satisfied the northern lords, who cherished their autonomy. Meanwhile, the direwolves became a constant presence. In King's Landing's broad squares, children would stand at a distance, pointing and giggling nervously at the giant beasts. Adults spoke in hushed tones of how these creatures answered only to Jon Snow, how they could sense evil in a man's heart. Soldiers marveled at their discipline in battle. Thieves and cutthroats quickly learned not to stalk dark alleys alone, lest they find glowing eyes and bared teeth in the gloom. Yet Jon knew that forging a new realm required more than the fear of direwolves or dragons. He took the time to speak directly with peasants and merchants, learning their grievances, ensuring that relief reached them. Daenerys, too, traveled incognito through the city, protected by a handful of trusted guards, listening to the people's stories. Over time, a cautious optimism spread. The horrors of war might finally be receding. When the day of Cersei's trial arrived, a somber crowd gathered in what had once been the Dragon Pit. The structure stood partially in ruins, but it was deemed large enough to host a public hearing. Lords and ladies took their seats on hastily constructed benches, while the small folk lined the edges, kept in check by the unsullied. Daenerys and Jon sat at the center on raised chairs, the symbol of the direwolf and the dragon prominently displayed behind them. Cersei was brought forth in chains, her face gaunt, her once golden hair now matted. She carried herself with defiant pride, refusing to cower. Charges were read. Regicide, destruction of the September of Baelor with wildfire, conspiracy to murder allies, breaking alliances that led to countless deaths, refusal to defend the realm against the undead. Witnesses spoke of her manipulations. She refuted or sneered at each accusation, showing no remorse. It fell to Daenerys and Jon to pass judgment. Tyrion recused himself, given his personal history, but he offered testimony of how Cersei had betrayed the alliance at the Dragon Pit meeting. In the end, the verdict was clear. The realm, through its new rulers, found her guilty. Cersei gazed around at the crowd, searching for any last ally, but found only stony faces. Daenerys' voice carried over the hush. For your crimes against the realm, the penalty is death. But the manner of that death is ours to decide. Cersei lifted her chin. Do it, Targaryen, she SP. Fulfill your family's legacy of blood and fire. Jon looked at Daenerys. He remembered how the Mad King had relished burning his foes, how mercilessly Rhaegar's father had sentenced men to die in agony. He recalled also how Sansa had fed Ramsay Bolton to his own hounds. Vengeance could become a poison. He placed a hand gently on Daenerys' arm. She regarded him, then gave a small nod. No flames, Daenerys declared. Take her to the block. Let it be swift, as the North would do. The crowd rippled with quiet shock. Many had expected a display of dragonfire, a final act of Targaryen fury. But the sentence stood. Cersei was led away, thrashing and cursing. Moments later, in a courtyard beside the broken stones, she was beheaded by a royal headsman. Jon oversaw it personally, standing stoic, eyes dark. The watchers carried the memory of that silent blade, the final breath of a queen who had nearly torn the realm apart. In the wake of Cersei's execution, the realm began to settle. Allies who had once feared the Lannister might return to pledge loyalty, seeing that no final reprisal was coming. Lands once under Lannister influence were reorganized, with local houses asked to govern fairly under the watch of royal emissaries. Tyrion busied himself with drafting new laws, aided by Varys's network of whispers, ensuring corruption was rooted out. The Hound, having slain his monstrous brother, found a strange sense of peace. He took to patrolling the city, occasionally partnering with a direwolf on nighttime hunts for criminals, a story that circulated among the tavern crowd with wide eyes and quiet jokes. Arya, restless as ever, planned journeys to explore the far reaches of the realm, though she made sure to return for important gatherings, her bond with her siblings unbroken. Daenerys and Jon turned their attention to healing the scars of war. They funded the rebuilding of roads, the replanting of fields ravaged by battles. They orchestrated large shipments of grain from the Reach to the Stormlands, ensuring no region starved through the tail end of winter. They set aside old feuds, forging treaties with Dorne and the Iron Islands, granting them autonomy in local matters while binding them to the broader peace. All the while, the direwolves remained a symbol of the new order, a reminder that the old ways of petty lords tearing at each other's throats would not be tolerated. Yet Jon was careful to ensure the wolves were not used merely as enforcers of fear. He allowed them to roam free, sometimes returning north for weeks at a time, then reappearing at the gates of King's Landing or Winterfell as if guided by an ancient sense of duty. The bond between Ghost and Jon never wavered. In the quiet hours of dawn, Jon would walk with Ghost through the empty corridors, thinking of all that had been lost, and all that might still be achieved. Eventually, the day came when Daenerys was officially crowned. The ceremony was held not in the Red Keep but in the city's Great September, rebuilt from the ruins of the one Cersei had destroyed. It was smaller, humbler, but it was filled with light from tall windows that let the sun spill onto the marble floors. Lords and ladies from every corner of the realm attended, alongside common folk who were given space to witness. Daenerys wore a simple crown of dragon motifs, while Jon stood beside her in the attire of a northern king, the direwolf crest prominent on his chest. Ghost and Nymeria stood at either side of the dais, regal and watchful, while Rhaegal and Drogon soared overhead, occasionally casting fleeting shadows through the windows. When the High Septon placed the crown on Daenerys's head, she did not kneel but stood tall, gazing over the assembled crowd with resolve. Her voice rang out, "I stand before you as Queen of the Seven Kingdoms, yet I have vowed to rule not through fear, but through justice and unity. We have seen the horrors of the long night. We have seen the evils of petty wars. Let this day mark the dawn of a new era, where dragons and wolves guard the realm, and the people's welfare guides the crown." The hall erupted in cheers, though some voices were subdued, uncertain of the future. Jon looked upon Daenerys with both respect and a sense of shared burden. He knew that her reign would be tested. He also sensed that the realm would look to him for stability, for the memory of how he had rallied men, wolves, and dragons to defeat the Night King. In the months that followed, Daenerys and Jon traveled, hosting regional councils that gave local lords a say in governance. They ensured that no single region felt excluded. They introduced measures to standardize coinage, to promote trade between regions once divided by war. There were arguments and disputes. Lords who felt threatened by the loss of absolute power, merchants who demanded concessions, priests who questioned the Targaryens' authority. But each time, the presence of direwolves, dragons, and the calm negotiations of Jon, Daenerys, Tyrion, and their advisors prevailed. In the Riverlands, they oversaw the reconstruction of war-torn towns. In the Westerlands, they confronted rebellious minor lords who still honored the Lannister name. Faced with the glare of dragons overhead and the unflinching stare of Ghost and his pack, the rebels soon bent the knee. In the Reach, Daenerys worked with the Tyrell heirs to restore farmland, ensuring an ample food supply for the entire continent. In Dorne, negotiations were delicate, but eventually a formal alliance was formed, guaranteeing Dornish autonomy and mutual defense. The Ironborn, under a reformed leadership after Euron's disappearance, agreed to respect the seas around Westeros, though they maintained some measure of the old Reaver traditions, a compromise that grated on some, but Jon insisted on forging unity through understanding rather than conquest alone. Through it all, the Direwolves remained an enduring legend, weaving a tapestry of fear, respect, and awe. Some new litters of pups were born, carrying on Duskfang's legacy. The old magic of the North lived on in them. They moved as if guided by a single consciousness, yet each wolf was distinct in temperament, some more aggressive, others more protective. Jon visited them often, forging a deeper bond, though never attempting to truly own them. They belonged to the North, to the old gods, and to themselves as much as they stood with him. Peace did not come overnight. There were border disputes, tensions among the faith militant, uprisings of discontented lords who believed a woman should not rule, or that dragons were abominations. But each time, the new realm responded decisively. When rebellious knights took up arms near Old Town, Daenerys and Jon flew there with a small group of Unsullied, accompanied by a pack of direwolves. The demonstration of unstoppable force and unwavering justice ended the revolt before it truly ignited. Slowly, the lords who once bickered for their own advantage adapted. Some truly believed in the new vision, an era where the crown worked to better the lives of its subjects. Others acquiesced out of fear, seeing no profit in challenging dragons and wolves. The small folk, for the most part, felt relief. Less random violence, less tyranny from petty warlords, the promise of stable harvests and open trade routes. One day, after nearly a year of traveling and consolidating alliances, Daenerys and Jon returned to King's Landing to find the city transformed. New houses were being built, roads repaired, orphanages stocked with supplies. Tyrion's cunning administrative hand had done much good. Ghost and Nymeria led the direwolves through the cobblestone streets, eliciting waves and smiles from children who had grown accustomed to their presence. Soldiers greeted Jon as king in the north, but also as a co-ruler in spirit. Many calling him the White Wolf. They reconvened in the courtyard of the Red Keep, where a great feast was prepared. Lords, ladies, commoners, and guests from across the sea attended, each wearing their best garb. Dragons perched in the background, a testament to Targaryen might. Direwolves wandered at the edges of the gathering, tolerated by all, even if some remained wary. Daenerys stood on a small dais, lifting her cup. Jon stood beside her, Ghost at his heel. The crowd hushed. She spoke in a clear voice. "We have faced the darkness beyond death, and we have faced the cruelty of men. Yet here we stand, united under one realm. To those who said it could not be done, I say we have only begun. Let the new age be one of prosperity and justice." Jon added, "The North remembers its struggles, and so does the rest of the realm. We stand together now, not as conqueror and conquered, but as free people who choose peace. We will make mistakes, but we will learn. And as long as the direwolves prowl our lands and the dragons soar above, let it be a reminder that this realm is unlike any other in memory." A roar of approval rose, and the sound of goblets clinking followed. Music began, and a spirit of hope filled the air. Though shadows of the past still lingered, the sense of a new beginning was palpable. As the celebrations wore on, Jon slipped away, moving to a high balcony overlooking Blackwater Bay. The moonlight danced on the dark water. Ghost followed silently, and together they stood looking out at the horizon. A gentle breeze ruffled the direwolf's pale fur. Jon's heart was full, yet tinged with melancholy for all that had been lost along the way. Friends, mentors, Duskfang, and the innocence of a simpler time. But he also felt a quiet pride in what they had achieved. He heard soft footsteps and turned to see Daenerys approaching, her silver-gold hair glimmering in the moonlight. She joined him at the balcony rail, gazing out over the city. For a moment, neither spoke. The hush of the night enveloped them. Then she said softly, "It feels almost dreamlike. I never truly thought we could unite the realm without a massive bloodbath. But thanks to you, and these wolves, fear took the place of war, and it opened a path for hope." Jon reached out, laying a hand over hers. "We did it together. With dragons and wolves, yes, but also with those who believed in something better. Daenerys tilted her head, giving him a gentle smile. Where do we go from here? Jon gazed upon Ghost, who looked back with calm, blood-red eyes. We make sure it lasts. We watch over Westeros, so that no terror from beyond the wall or from across the sea can tear it apart again. We honor those who fell, and we ensure the living have a future worth protecting. Daenerys turned her face to the stars. Then let us do it side by side. Let the songs speak of dragons and direwolves, of a queen who would not rule by fire alone, and of a king who sought no crown yet wore one for the good of all. Jon pulled her closer, the warmth of her body a reminder that, amidst all the cold realities of leadership, they still lived, still felt. Far below, the city teemed with life, the newly crowned capital of a realm emerging from darkness into a fragile peace. Overhead, Rhaegal and Drogon glided on the night air, watchful sentinels. And prowling among the shadows, direwolves ensured that petty criminals or assassins dared not disrupt the moment. In the days and years that followed, the tapestry of Westeros continued to unfold. Not every grievance was solved overnight, nor did every lord renounce ambition or greed. But the presence of a unified crown, held by Daenerys Targaryen and Jon Snow, held the realm's fractures in check. Where the old methods of intimidation might have led to endless uprisings, the new rule combined measured severity, enforced by direwolves and dragons, with genuine concern for the welfare of the people. Gradually, trust grew. Roads became safer. Towns flourished with trade. More than once, Jon found himself traveling north again, this time with Daenerys, to pay respects to the crypts of Winterfell. Ghost always returned eagerly to roam the snowy forests, accompanied by the rest of the pack. The wildlings had established new settlements, living more harmoniously than ever before with northern houses, bound by the memory of shared sacrifice against the undead. Sansa ruled the north with a gentle but firm hand, content that her brother and Daenerys were ensuring the wider realm did not fall into chaos again. When they returned south, Jon and Daenerys brought new recruits for the royal guard, forging a structure that combined the discipline of the Unsullied with the fierce independence of northern warriors. The infiltration of direwolves into the city guard was informal. Wolves did not wear tabards or take orders in any conventional sense, but it became common to see one or two resting at guard posts, their presence enough to deter thieves or rebellious knights. Over time, the question of succession arose: would Daenerys and Jon have heirs, and would the direwolves remain allied when the next generation took power? Some men whispered that the bond was tied to Jon's lineage, the blood of the first men, the old magic of the north. Others speculated that it was Daenerys' Targaryen blood that had awakened the wolves, though that seemed less likely. Regardless, the realm settled into an era of rare prosperity. Stories spread across the seas, drawing the attention of foreign princes and merchants. They came to marvel at the realm ruled by a queen of dragons and a king of wolves, whose combined might had prevented another cycle of devastation. Such tales, told in taverns from Bravos to Volantis, described how a single direwolf could unman the bravest Sellsword, and how the merest glimpse of a dragon overhead could bring a city to heel. Yet these powers were not used to pillage or enslave, but to protect the peace. And so, through the quiet reign of Daenerys Targaryen and Jon Snow, Westeros healed and evolved. Taxes were used to rebuild roads, harbors, and farmlands. The faith was granted certain rights but restricted from forming militant orders that could challenge the crown's authority. The old houses begrudgingly accepted that unity was the surest path to security. The new generation grew up without the horrors of constant warfare, learning that the old stories of White Walkers and monstrous tyrants were warnings of what could happen if vigilance was lost. In that new Westeros, the presence of direwolves became more than a novelty. They symbolized the land's primal spirit, the bond between man and nature, old magic and new order. Whenever a child in Flea Bottom or a remote village saw one stalking through the streets or across a field, they whispered that the White Wolf and his queen would not allow evil to fester. The memory of the long night remained close enough that no one wished to court darkness again. Thus did Jon Snow and Ghost, allied with Daenerys and her dragons, conquer Westeros in a manner unlike any conquest before. It was a triumph of might tempered by mercy, of fear balanced by hope. Where the Targaryens of old had burned and subjugated, this new regime sought to defend and unite. Where the Starks had guarded only the north, now they stood watch over the entire realm. And where direwolves had once been but a rare sigil on a banner, they now roamed the breadth of the land, living testaments to the era's changes. At times, as Jon walked King's Landing's newly paved streets, he felt the weight of expectations pressing down on him, the ghosts of the past lurking in every shadow. He would find a moment of solace at the edge of the city, where Ghost might lead him to a quiet hillside overlooking the Blackwater Bay. Sitting there, he could hear the distant murmur of the city, smell the salt wind, and remember the nights he spent beyond the wall, howling gales and endless dark. The world had changed in ways he never could have imagined. He had changed along with it. But in those quiet moments he felt a peace, knowing that at least for now, the realm was safe and no monstrous threat stalked the night. When he rose from the hillside, Ghost would accompany him back, ears perked, eyes scanning for danger. Daenerys might be waiting in the courtyard, a gentle smile on her lips, or Arya might be preparing for another journey, eager to see how far the new roads would take her. Tormund might be telling tall tales to a group of city children about the giant wolves of the true north. Tyrion and Sansa might be bickering good-naturedly over how best to allocate funds to rebuild Lannisport or the harbors of the Vale. The daily tasks and complications of ruling were endless, but they were the problems of a kingdom at peace. As seasons shifted and rumors spread that spring was at last on the horizon, the people of Westeros began to believe they had turned a corner in history. No single threat loomed to tear them apart. No unstoppable enemy advanced on their borders. They had found a measure of unity under the watch of dragons and direwolves, forging a fragile but meaningful new order. Cersei's tyranny was but a lesson in what pride and ruthlessness could cost, and the Night King's shadow had retreated to the pages of history. Sometimes, scholars in Old Town debated the nature of the direwolves' loyalty. They pored over ancient tomes, searching for references to wargs, skin changers, and the deeper mysteries of the North. They wrote letters to King's Landing, seeking interviews with Jon Snow or glimpses of the wolves, but received only polite refusals. In the city, the popular consensus was that the wolves served the old gods, and Jon Snow was their chosen champion. Whether that was literally true or just poetic fancy, few could say, but it was enough to sustain a sense of wonder. Occasionally, foreign diplomats arrived, wide-eyed as they beheld dragons perched on the ramparts and direwolves prowling the palace halls. They found a realm brimming with trade, new alliances, and the unspoken threat that any would-be conqueror would face unimaginable resistance. Jon and Daenerys handled them with courtesy, forging pacts of commerce and friendship, subtly reminding them that Westeros was no longer a fractured land ripe for exploitation. In each passing year, the story of how Jon Snow and Ghost had rivaled the Night King with an army of direwolves grew into legend. Minstrels sang ballads of the White Wolf, the Dragon Queen, and their pack of shadowy hunters who carried the spirit of the North into the heart of the capital. Children memorized the verse. When the night was black and hope was fled, the wolves rose up to guard the dead. The dragon soared, the wolf did roam, and thus they brought our kingdom home. Jon often found these songs embarrassing, even grandiose, but as time wore on, he realized they served a purpose, reminding the people of what had been won and lost, and how unity had saved them from certain doom. The realm needed stories, needed heroes, needed a sense that, for once, the cycle of bloodshed had been broken, or at least paused. So the years unfolded, each season bringing its challenges. A drought in Dorne, a plague scare in the Westerlands, a trade dispute with Bravos, but no great wars, no sweeping cataclysm. And in King's Landing, still overshadowed by the half-ruined Red Keep and the ghosts of thousands of years of conflict, a new generation grew up under the watchful eyes of dragons and direwolves. They learned that the crown was not an object of fear, but a steward of the realm's welfare. They played in courtyards once soaked with blood, now vibrant with gardens. They heard direwolves howl at night, a sound that once would have been terrifying, but now seemed strangely comforting. a reminder that the protectors of the North never slept. And in a quiet corner of the Red Keep, Jon Snow would sometimes kneel before a small shrine to the old gods. He would think of Eddard Stark, of Duskfang, of all those who had fallen in the wars past. He would silently renew his vow to protect Westeros, to guide it so that no threat could claim countless lives as the others had nearly done. Whenever doubt gnawed at him, he felt ghost press against him, warm and alive, a silent affirmation of all they had accomplished. Thus did Jon Snow and Ghost, side by side with Daenerys Targaryen and her dragons, complete their conquest of Westeros, through unity rather than mere conquest, through fear balanced by compassion, through the timeless bond between man and beast. The North still remembered, the dragons still soared, and the direwolves roamed free. And for the first time in living memory, the realm knew a lasting peace, guarded by the legends that walked among them, reminding all of the price of war and the preciousness of life.